Hi class! So for this next video lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about stress, epigenetics, and how that in turn affects mental and physical health outcomes. So this model basically describes how early childhood experiences, whether that's poverty or your socioeconomic status just in general, your early family environment, as well as your genetic predispositions, and also the impact of different types of stressors um, can be mediated by social support and coping resources. But if it's not, then it can lead to prolonged psychological distress, especially if you've experienced some really negative events in your life, and how that in turn over time impacts your mental and physical health risks. So that term that you saw in that on that first slide is epigenetics, which means literally above the genome. And the genome is basically the order of our human DNA. There's this project called the Human Genome Project. It was an international scientific study, and the purpose of it was to identify and map all of the genes in the human genome to better understand why certain conditions arise, what happens with disease development, and it has some real promise for the future of potentially personalized medicine. So in epigenetics, there's something that occurs in your biography that can change something about your inherited biology, right? So it could be such things as stress and nutrition and exposure to toxins, which can change some aspect of your DNA and lead to the development or lack thereof of certain type of health outcomes. Doing so by putting epigenetic markers, which can turn on or turn off whether or not, again, you develop some type of health outcome. So think of it as, again, as kind of the switch which influence your likelihood, a genetic signaling, which tells your body whether or not to express a certain type of gene. So stress can be one of those epigenetic influences, especially over the lifespan. Now, children experience three main types of stress. That includes positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. So to describe positive stress, it's brief. It's actually totally normal for people to have a stress response to something that, again, stimulates that stress, right? And in general, stress doesn't always necessarily have to be this negative thing. It can prompt you to do something. It is critical for survival. It could tell you when there's something, when you're in danger. It could also activate a fear response to tell you to be on guard. But over time, an overly active stress response can lead to inflammation, buildup of cortisol, and all types of negative mental health outcomes. With positive stress, again, however, some examples could be meeting new people, when adults put rules on what you can and can't do, going to daycare for the first day. What positive stress can teach you to do are to develop certain coping skills that say, if I ever encounter this type of stress again, I'll know what to do. There's tolerable stress. It's a bit more intense and severe than this positive stress. And basically, it could be the result of a longer lasting difficulty. And it puts your body into this fight or flight response, again, which activates your cortisol and says, we need to do something. We need to get out of here or we need to fight this problem. So it could be something like being in a car accident or living through a natural disaster or having a loved one die. And with this more prolonged stress is when you start seeing more negative health outcomes. The good news is this stress can be buffered by having a caring adult empathize with you and also just try to help walk you through this stressful time. Now, more prolonged stress, which has the most negative outcomes, is something called toxic stress. It's a stressor that tends to be strong and frequent and prolonged within childhood development. So some examples of what could be toxic stressors could be family violence, a family addiction, right? And parents not being as, or caregivers not being as cognitively present because they're battling an addiction, chronic neglect, physical, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and enduring poverty. And these types of stressors prolong that stress response, right? So you've got more inflammation, you've got more buildup of cortisol, and you've got more ramifications on your mental health than you would by tolerable stress. Children generally tend to be incapable of managing this type of stressor on their own. And the earlier you intervene and the earlier there is a caring caregiver who can help mitigate the stress, the better the health outcomes for that child. So what exactly do these prolonged stress and what does this trauma do to the brain? So first let's take a look at some of the main functions of your brain's executive functions. You've got the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of planning and future thought, and also contributes to personality. There's the amygdala, which the larger the amygdala, it tends to mean the more generous and the more empathetic a person. But it's also where you experience emotion and where you start remembering emotions, such as where you experience and remember such feelings such as fear. And the hippocampus are where your memories are stored. So with trauma and with prolonged stress, the prefrontal cortex decreases in size. So your planning functions are impaired and your personality is negatively impacted. With chronic stress and with abuse, your amygdala is enlarged, meaning you tend to have a lower threshold for what sends your body into that fight or flight response in terms of when you experience stress. And with the hippocampus, trauma decreases the size of your hippocampus. So if you've ever talked to someone and they've blocked out parts of their youth, and you hear later that they had endured trauma during their childhood, that's often because of that trauma, their certain memories are basically erased. There's some good news, however. The earlier you intervene with having a stable environment, with having an empathetic caregiver who is a stable caregiver and who's showing a more nurturing environment, the better the health effects. If you're interested, check out this learngeneticsutah.edu. This is actually results from a rat and rat pup study that shows that the more that a mother rat nurtures her rat pup, and in the case you can actually play the mother rat and you can lick, which is a sign of nurturing the rat pup. The more that mother rat nurtures the rat pup at an earlier age, the better that rat pup's stress response is over its lifespan, and also the better its immune system functions as it grows older. So here's an example also of, it was a natural experiment, meaning that this was not something that was necessarily planned, but it was an outcome of what happened during political disarray in the country of Romania. In 1989, there was the fall of the Romanian dictator, and basically the political system as a whole somewhat collapsed in Romania. And at that time, what occurred were things that were publicly funded, such as institutions, such as orphanages, didn't receive the same type of resources and oversight as it would have had it been a more functioning political environment. At this time, the orphanage was understaffed, abuse was rampant, and neglect was a way of life in this orphanage. There were 136 children that were found at the time that this study began monitoring the health of these children. So basically, there wasn't this before and after what happens with healthy infants versus unhealthy infants. It was basically this orphanage was discovered. These children who were basically institutionalized even within the institution, as you can see this picture of what looks like children that are way too old to be in a crib being, housed in their own cribs. Basically what happens is once these children were discovered, scientists wanted to know, well, what happened when these children were neglected and they didn't receive the love and nurturance and there weren't enough people to provide care for them. What they found were that They conducted something called an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, and that helps reveal the brain structure, and something known as the EEG, which helps detect electrical brain activity. And what they found was reduced gray matter or brain cell bodies, as well as less cognitive activity in the children who had prolonged neglect for the longest amount of time. Some of the children, upon being found, were adopted into the foster care system. Some remained in the orphanage even after they were found. The children that were rescued and put into the foster care system or were reunited with their biological parents over time found better health outcomes and better psychological outcomes as compared to the children that remained in the foster care system. So what this means is that getting that child out of the orphanage earlier had a stronger impact and a healthier impact over the children's lifespan. So institutionalization is not healthy for any child, but the earlier that you intervene and the earlier that you start providing a stable environment and a caring, nurturing environment, the better off the children will be. What children need to develop psychologically and physically healthy, they need a stable environment, and they need caring relationships from caregivers, from adults. If you were to say, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of policy implications? If we were to try to say, how can we target these upstream factors to prevent this type of neglect or to prevent negative outcomes from neglect? If you start closer to downstream, you can find policies that focus on child protective services, identifying those at-risk families and identifying those at-risk children who are in homes where they're being neglected earlier for earlier intervention. If you want to go a little bit more upstream, you could focus on really ensuring that parents and caregivers have the necessary mental health services that they need. So a lot of the abandonment that children can experience doesn't necessarily have to be if they're institutionalized or in an orphanage or in a foster care system. Abandonment can occur because of severe parental depression or because of addiction. Um, so the earlier these things are detected, prevented, or even treated, the better off the child will be downstream. And also by focusing on policies that help impact family economic support, you can help reduce some of the impact of prolonged stress on the parents, of depression and anxiety that are linked back um, to not feeling like you have the resources to live, to pay your bills, to provide for your family, to provide for yourself, right? So all of these are considered more upstream factors that, again, if targeted, may be able to help reduce the likelihood that children will experience these negative events or these traumatic events at a younger age.